2018, I mean, I remember by that point I was sort of had a professional interest in ecclesial matters, right? I was working and writing about Catholic things. So I think 2018, and I was at Mass on the Feast of the Assumption at St. Matthew's Cathedral when Cardinal Wuerl addressed
Wow.
the release of the report, and I remember vividly the feeling of the palpable feeling in the church of, he spoke in the first person plural a lot, and I think there were a lot of people wondering, was someone else in this church the Bishop of Pittsburgh, or was what's this we?
Yeah.
2002, I was in college still. I'm that young. And one of the things that I didn't forget, but it had been lost on me a little bit, was, well, two things really. One is that when this became big news in Spotlight, I remember at the time thinking, is this really news? I mean, I thought people knew that there were stories like this out there and that there had been a lot of them. I mean, there were obviously the stories that came out in the Spotlight were new, but growing up in Chicago and Milwaukee,
right,
it wasn't something we talked about all the time, but it wasn't unheard of to hear a story about a priest who had done these sorts of things. That was, even as a teenager, and that wasn't something that would be talked to about. Not something, my parents wouldn't sit down and talk about this, or the adults wouldn't discuss it too much in front of me when I was younger.
Yeah,
but I was aware of it. And so 2002, there was this feeling of, is this really totally surprising to everybody? I kind of just sort of knew this.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, and this in a sense didn't occur to me at the time because we were sort of in the middle of things, but looking back on it now, I was in Rome for the Great Jubilee in 2000. And the close of the Great Jubilee, Pope John Paul II talked about, he had talked a lot about a new springtime for the church and putting out into the deep. The Jubilee closed on the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6, 2001. And it was exactly 1 year later to the day that the Boston Globe ran its first Spotlight story. And in between those two events were exactly 12 months apart. 9/11 happened. It's odd that I don't, 9/11 and the breaking of the abuse crisis happened just 6 months apart.
Yeah.
Not even.
Yeah.
And for people my age and a little bit younger, I've come to see, in retrospect, I think, that going from the optimism of the Jubilee, for which the church had been preparing for a long time, for years, going from the optimism of the Jubilee through this sort of whiplash, the social, political, and whiplash of 9/11 into the ecclesial crisis of 2002 has really had a lasting effect, I think. That was a pretty traumatic time, especially noticeable in retrospect, in hindsight, for people, especially for Catholics my age and a little bit younger than me, who were just, had grown up, and their first sort of taste of Catholicism as an adult was pretty chaotic.
Let's bring that out. That's a very powerful point. Yeah. And where does it, and yet where do you draw for the strength of your faith under those chaotic circumstances, or are they kind of help you clarify your faith?
For me, I'm trying to figure out how to say this without sounding, human depravity and hardship are not the sorts of thing that, so far, have ever really shaken my faith. They're sort of the whole reason that we need the faith to begin with, right? Was the whole point of being a Catholic is that we live in a fallen world,
Yeah.
right? We need to be saved from sin. So my faith has always sort of presupposed a certain kind of depravity. Now, there are particular awful things that had never occurred to someone, or that you experience in one way or another for the first time, that can be jarring.
Yeah.
But the idea that human beings and Catholics, including bishops, could do certain things or fail to do certain things, has never really touched the heart of my faith. I guess that it just hasn't. More recently, and this gets kind of to my point about the whiplash from going from the optimism to sort of this time of sort of chaos. I grew up, I'm a Catholic of the John Paul II generation. And, I've written about this recently, so it's also at the front of my mind. John Paul II began his pontificate telling people, be not afraid. Non abbiate paura, right? Be not afraid, and put out into the deep. And there was a kind of optimism that came with those messages, or those messages were received with a kind of optimism. But those aren't messages for a church that is entering a time of comfort and consolation.
Yeah.
They're not be not afraid is not a message for people that is experiencing comfort and ease.
Yeah.
Put out into the deep is not a message for a church that has arrived on a safe shore. So if there was those messages, while the expectation for what lay ahead of the church, say when I was 18, the church and the world have turned out a little different than what I expected, perhaps in 1999. But the message of courage and steadfastness, and be prepared for what lies ahead, trust in the Lord because it's going to be hard, those messages are as applicable and apt for today as ever. Whether John Paul II knew the wisdom of his prophetic message or not, I don't know. But they weren't his words to begin with, right? Those were the words of Christ. So they have a timelessness that I find comforting and I find in consolation. If the church is going to be purified, if God is purifying his church, we shouldn't be surprised to find that it is an unpleasant and painful experience. And so when hardship comes, part of this maybe is just I'm Midwesterner. Maybe it's just my phlegmatic nature. When hardship comes, my sort of first instinct is to say, how are we being made stronger as a church by this? How am I being made a better Christian, a better disciple by this? Sometimes that's easy to say, it's easy to see. Sometimes it's very hard. But I don't think there's ever a time when we can forget that our salvation lies through the cross.
Yeah.
That's the only way. It's coming for us whether we see it or not, whether we want to accept it or not. It's there for us. So we should try not to be too surprised when it arrives, and try not to be resentful when it does. So
it's powerful what you're saying, and I'm just going to go with we're just going to talk this through in the sense that I think that's why it's comfortable when Spirit Fire partners with you and with the Catholic Project, because while you never pretend to know what we've gone through as survivors, but what you do is you don't recoil from the evil that we've encountered. You're not in a fight or in a battle to hide it, because you're not afraid of it. You be not afraid of it, and you're really curious on a spiritual level of how to integrate it into your faith and into the church in a dignified way. And I think that's a really special, unusual wave. I feel that from a lot of younger Catholics too, where it could be because we've been exposed, younger Catholics have more of a language than people who grew up in the 50s and 60s had. We had to kind of learn the language that then a different generation became more comfortable with. I don't know, but I do think that the charisms of the younger people, you're not that much younger than me, but you have had a different slice of experience, and I marvel. I attach your ability to work with us comfortably because we come in sometimes in really rough shape to do some of, an event can be really hard for some of my survivors that come with me. I attribute their ease with you is an ability to be present with the evil we experienced and not look away. And that's a good way not to shame somebody, to just say you aren't some other person's sin. You got that from the first conversation we had about the potential of working together.
Mm.
And that's pretty, but then of course, fast forward to 2018. So you're sitting in St. Matthew's, you're hearing the report. What then got you to the Catholic Project from what you were doing?
I had been writing on ecclesial issues for at that point more than a decade, and I had been writing specifically about the abuse crisis
Mm-hmm.
on a regular basis for several months. The Catholic Project had already begun before I had ever heard of it. It was
Really?
an initiative of John Garvey's, and he had the idea that the university, because it's the church's university in the United States, the bishop's university,
Mm-hmm.
because our chancellor had been Theodore McCarrick back, but by the Archbishop of Washington is always the chancellor of the university. He thought that there was a responsibility for the university to do what it could to help the church in this moment. He thought that it was also an opportunity. The university has not to sound like a commercial for Catholic University, but the university really has a unique set of faculties and expertise at its disposal. We have the country's only canon law faculty, and we have a school of social work.
Yeah.
And we have the pontifical faculties in theology and philosophy and all the rest. But we have this broad range, and so we have experts already there who can help with some of the things that the university and the laity can help with. And there was a sense that the laity had a role to play in getting the church through this.
Mm-hmm.
That we need our bishops, and whatever reforms or renewal will come for the church, it will come with and through the bishops and with the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that they'll be the ones who think of the ideas, and they may come along following rather than leading, but there's no church without them. So we can't be antagonistic towards them, but we have to, and we can't replace them with ourselves, but there has to be this sense of collaboration and cooperation. If the bishops, through their own fault or because their credibility has been badly damaged, their ability to lead in a moment like this has been compromised, we need to be able to do what we can to help the church in a moment like this, and the university can play a role in that. We can help educate, we can raise awareness, we can develop programs and research projects to try and do some of what needs to be done. And that was the idea of the Catholic Project. It was a sort of a John Garvey quickly realized that he had a university to run and he couldn't do it all himself on the side. So they asked me if I would be the executive director, and that's how I landed there. And the first year was a bit like building an airplane mid-flight. We had a lot of things that we wanted to get off the ground, and we had a lot of ideas we wanted to implement. We were still sort of figuring out how we fit in the university and what our mission was exactly, and what kinds of things we would do and what kinds of things we wouldn't do. And we can't do everything. And so we've focused in a couple areas. The podcast is one of them, crisis. We have a certificate program in child protection and safe environments that we're that we've built out, and we're building out online so we can provide training for people around the country and around the world, inside the church and out of the church. People.
Yeah, can I interrupt you on that one? It's
Yeah.
like one of the things is other faiths are coming to us. They're later in their progress of coping with in putting together child protection programs, and they come to the church for expertise. And now there's this really wonderful program can teach that to people. That's a really amazing thing.
One of the things that people ask me, what do you hope for the Catholic Project? And one of the things that I always tell them is that my hope is that there are people and institutions, parts of the church, but also institutions and organizations outside of the church who can learn from what we've gotten wrong, and also from what we've gotten right. We Catholics have gotten some things right too.
Yeah.
Been lessons hard learned. But if our failings as a church can help other people not make the same mistakes, or help them recover in a more humane and sensible way than we sometimes have after we have stumbled. Mm-hmm. If we can help do that, that will be a huge success for the Catholic Project and for everybody.
For everybody.
This isn't just a Catholic problem. Mm-hmm. And our efforts as Catholics ought to be, at least in part, directed towards helping everybody. Because as I said, this is this kind of abuse is a society-wide problem.
It's also very powerful what you're saying too, because besides the Crisis, the podcast, which I would recommend to people, mm-hmm. You've also, I met you, I think when you invited me to a speaker series, which you did the first year that you were there, I think, it was very fruitful. It was for lay people just to reflect on, before you react, just reflect on all of the different things that are going on. As I recall, it was a pretty powerful lineup of speakers. I was the best speaker, but
by far, in fact. This was one of the first initiatives, was a lecture series about the crisis, and it began, I think, in November of 2018, before the Catholic Project had a name, with a panelist of Catholic journalists who had been covering sort of the breaking news of 2018 and sort of just try and get a sense of what the heck is going on. What are the important questions we're still looking for answers to, some of which we're still looking for answers to. And then in the spring of 2019, we had a series of 3 days of lectures, of February, March, and April, looking at different aspects. We had one conference on the theme of causes of the crisis. What is it? Clericalism? Is it changes in the way the church teaches theology, as Benedict XVI had suggested was part of the cause? And we looked at lots of different causes. We looked at what lay people can do to, how do we understand the role of the laity in the church? Historically, what has the laity been able to do in the church? Laity used to have a really, laity in the past have sometimes had a very important role in the church that we don't even think of often now, right? A Catholic monarch is a lay person, and they can exercise great influence on the church. We don't have those anymore, and so I think there's a certain almost a vacuum. Lay people are looking for ways to help the church, hopefully, not just to exert power or an influence over the church. We're looking for ways to participate in the growth and mission of the church. And we haven't always been good about figuring out how to do that. A lot of times our discussions about the role of the laity focus on who gets to do what, on division of labor questions. And those are important questions, but that kind of question only gets you so far. And it tends to devolve into sort of antagonism between laity and clergy. Much more interesting question, but I think a much more difficult question to pose, and a more difficult question to answer, is if the laity is living its mission fully, say according to the vision laid out in Lumen Gentium, what then does the church look like? That's a much more interesting question, and like I said, it's a lot harder to answer in some ways. We're still figuring that out, but we wanted to pose some questions like that, and And so there was these four events really, that we tried to answer some of those. And the events, at least in 2019, had a more academic flavor to them. And we quickly realized that that was helpful in some ways, but the greatest interest we were getting was from sort of well-informed lay people who wanted a forum to better understand what was going on in the church, a chance to come and talk talk through some of the issues about what was afflicting the church. And so that was a fruitful series. Later that fall, we had another event on priests. In an odd way, this iteration of the crisis, 2018 and 19 and into today, there's been a lot of focus on bishops and what they've done and failed to do. There's been a lot of focus on the laity and what we can do. But priests have in a certain way been the odd men out. And I wanted a panel so that priests would have a chance to talk about how they have experienced the crisis. How has this changed the view of their own ministry? How has this changed their relationship with their fellow priests, or with the people of their parish, or with their bishop? So we had a panel on that, which was really interesting to hear what some of these men had to say about what it's like. There's a sort of double betrayal for priests. We've as a layman, I feel that when my priests have done something wrong, that's our priest. For the priest, this is not just the betrayal that all Catholics feel, but there's a fraternity there with your brother priest, and that sort of double sense of betrayal.
Well, and also
we don't talk about much.
Yeah, there's also the betrayal of isolated hierarchy. It's one of the things when we work with priests. It's interesting what you're saying about lay people and the choice of how to work with the bishops and priests, because one of the things we go in purposely to, as actually you hosted a Spirit Fire event where we came together with Spirit Fire survivors and bishops and many others, including you, and just had kind of a facilitated dialogue and hearing and panel that lasted a full day. But it's almost, even before you collaborate, I notice you're doing this too, where you just put information out there so that people can start thinking a different way and find a way to relate as brothers and sisters in Christ, even if you don't necessarily like each other at the time. It's because lay people really, you end up with the lay people's dynamic where they've got to work together too and resolve conflict over how to go forward. And I've just seen that modeled in your program, and encouraging across the board. And of course, you've been a wonderful host for us at times too.
Well, we try. We get some things right. We get and I'm very happy that you brought up that event that we hosted, that we co-sponsored with Spirit Fire in May, I believe, of 2019. It's not every day that one can spend a full day with bishops and survivors and others talking about the failings of the church in this regard and come away edified. And that was the big takeaway for me. It was an edifying day. It wasn't an easy day. It was a long day, and there were some tough conversations, but it was edifying. And I think one of the things that's difficult, especially these days, I don't even know what I mean by these days, but it's sometimes an investment of time, of personal relationships, which takes time, is the necessary foundation for fruitful collaboration, for reconciliation and healing, for all kinds of things. If we're just talking at people, or trying to score points, or trying to make sure that we get the last word in, we can convey a lot of information, but we don't build any kind of trust. There's not a shared experience of trying to understand what the other person is saying, trying to put in the effort to take them at their word, to try and speak carefully so that we're conveying what we really mean, and not trying to just score points or something like that. And that's not always easy. It takes work, but in my experience, it's almost always worth the time. And what results from that is, I think, as I certainly found with you, is spending time working with you you are able to build a certain amount of trust so that collaboration becomes more than just a division of labor, right? You'll do this and I'll do that. It becomes something that where the work is sort of exceeds what any one of the collaborators could do on their own. The parts sort of are more than their sum in a way.
It's very powerful, because it was like that when I interviewed for a piece of one of the crisis podcasts. You know, I came away full of a level of joy of the interaction, not because this happened to me. And just like on the day at the campus when we had survivors there, there was no denial that we had gone through terrible things, but you turn and people are laughing, and there's a warmth and there's an ease, and it's on that that we build well-being. And I just think you all take it really seriously. I do hope people check out your website, see the kind of stuff you're doing. And even if they're not local, there's a lot of stuff that they can access that could be really helpful for where they are. So, and I just thank you and everyone there that's doing all the work. It's great.
Thank you. It's, I'm constantly trying to balance two things in our work. One is to have the ambition to try and tackle real problems and not just sort of nibble around the edges. To really think about what might make a difference, to try and, where possible, think outside the box, that we're pursuing big ideas that are worth doing. And at the same time, I need to remind myself to really stay humble about what it is we're trying to do. It's a great way to waste time and money and energy to try and fix the church.
Right.
In the sense that the church will grow and heal if the Holy Spirit grows it and heals it. And we can collaborate with that, or we cannot. But it's not something we can just effect of our own will. And so I think that our work is important. I think there's plenty to do. But I hope that we always, and I strive to always, approach that challenge with the humility to say, this isn't my church. I don't actually know exactly what the church needs. I can accomplish certain things that are set in front of me, and I can do my best to help build up the church. But that work is his work ultimately, not mine. And that its success will be to his credit, not to mine. And I think keeping that in mind is a good way, at least not to go wrong. So hopefully we can keep not going wrong.